Australia has 10 everyday essentials that Americans are legally banned from buying. And number 3 will make you question everything about your healthcare system. But wait. Before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. I'm talking about things Australians take for granted every single day. Things that keep them healthier, wealthier, and frankly, less stressed than Americans. And before you think this is just anti-American propaganda, stick around, because the data's gonna shock you. Let's start with the one that hits you the moment you get sick. 10. Universal healthcare. What if I told you Australians pay $0 for life-saving medications that cost Americans $1,200 a month? Meet Jessica. She's 34, from Phoenix, diabetic, and she traveled to Sydney for a work conference in October 2025. Her insulin pump malfunctioned on day 2. She panicked. Back home, insulin costs her $340 a month even with insurance. She walked into a random Sydney pharmacy expecting financial devastation. The pharmacist charged her $42 Australian dollars. That's 27 US dollars. For the exact same medication. She literally cried in the store. Here's why. Australia has something called the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, the PBS. It caps most prescription medications at 31.60 Australian dollars, life-saving drugs that cost Americans hundreds or thousands of dollars. Australians pay pocket change. According to a 2025 RAND Corporation study, Americans pay 256% more for identical prescription drugs compared to Australians. And get this, 45 million Americans skip medications every year because they can't afford them. The Commonwealth Fund reported that in 2025, 45 million people choosing between medicine and rent. Now, some Americans have figured this out. There's a growing trend called pharmacy tourism. Americans traveling to Australia, Canada, or Mexico to buy months of medication at same prices. Some expats even coordinate legal prescription transfer programs. But here's the thing. You shouldn't have to fly 8,000 miles to afford insulin. That's healthcare. But what about something simpler? Like candy? 9. Kinder Surprise eggs. This chocolate egg has been illegal in America for 52 years, but every Australian kid grows up with them. The reason? It reveals a disturbing truth about who really writes U.S. safety laws. Marcus is 8 years old, American, visiting Brisbane with his family in November 2025. His Australian cousin gave him a Kinder Surprise egg. You know, the chocolate egg with a toy inside. Marcus loved it. His mother, Karen, a lawyer from Chicago, saw it and panicked. She knew bringing Kinder Surprises back to the U.S. meant a $2,500 fine per egg. At the Brisbane airport, she watched Australian families casually pack them in luggage while she had to throw hers in the trash. Why is it banned? The FDA prohibited Kinder Surprise in 1973 under a law that prevents non-food items inside food. Sounds reasonable, right? Except the same FDA approves pharmaceutical ads directly to consumers, which Australia and most developed nations ban because they are dangerous. A 2024 Consumer Reports investigation found U.S. food lobby groups spent $106 million fighting food safety regulations that Australia implemented a decade ago. So you can't have a toy and a chocolate egg, but companies can advertise opioids on primetime TV. Americans can legally buy Kinder Joy, a different product where the toy and chocolate are separated. But it's not the same. The original Kinder Surprise, available in Canada, Mexico, and every country on Earth except the United States. The candy ban seems silly until you realize what it says about American consumer protection laws. But the next one, it could literally save your life. 8. Paid sick leave. Every Australian worker gets 10 days of paid sick leave by law. In America, 33 million workers get 0. Here's why Australian McDonald's employees have better benefits than American nurses. Tom is 29, an Australian project manager who transferred to his company's New York office in January 2025. Within 3 months, he caught the flu. His American colleagues came to work sick, coughing at desks, sneezing in meetings. One woman had a fever of 101 and still showed up. Tom asked why they didn't stay home. They looked at him like he was insane. We don't have sick days. If we don't work, we don't get paid. 2 of his co-workers got pneumonia. 1 ended up hospitalized. Tom used his accumulated sick leave, still valid from Australia, and watched in horror as his US colleagues suffered because that's just how it works here. Here's the reality. Australia's Fair Work Act mandates 10 days paid sick leave annually for all full-time employees. The US has 0 federal sick leave requirement. None. The Economic Policy Institute reported in 2025 that 33 million American workers, that's 24% of the private sector workforce, have no paid sick days at all. During flu season 2024 to 2025, U.S. workplaces saw 34% more disease transmission than comparable Australian workplaces. That's CDC data compared to Australia's Department of Health. Some U.S. states, California, Massachusetts, New York, have enacted their own sick leave laws. But if you're checking job offers, you need to specifically negotiate sick leave as a benefit, because it's not guaranteed. But even healthy Australians have an advantage Americans don't. And this one happens 5 times a week. 7. Livable minimum wage. An 18-year-old working at an Australian Starbucks earns $24.10 per hour. The same job in America? $7.25. That's not a typo, that's a system. Meet Chloe. She's 19, works at a Melbourne cafe in 2025. She earns $24.10 Australian dollars per hour. That's the minimum wage. With that, she saved enough to rent her own apartment while studying part-time at university. Her American friend, Brad, works 50 hours a week at 2 retail jobs in Texas. He makes $7.25 an hour at both. He still lives with his parents because he can't afford rent, car insurance, and student loan payments. Same age, same work ethic, completely different lives. Australia's national minimum wage as of July 2025, 24.10 Australian dollars per hour, which is $882.80 per week. The US federal minimum wage, $7.25. It hasn't changed since 2009, that's 16 years. Adjusted for inflation, the US minimum wage has 29% less purchasing power than in 1970. Here's the kicker. Australian minimum wage workers can afford median rent with 32% of their income. American minimum wage workers need 96% of their income for the same thing. That's MIT Living Wage calculated data from 2025. Now, 30 U.S. states have raised minimum wages above the federal level. That's good. But if you're in one of the 20 states still stuck at $7.25, you're basically working full-time and still living in poverty. That's money in your pocket. But what about your actual safety? The next one exposes why Americans are dying from something Australians banned decades ago. 6. Gun control. Australia hasn't had a mass shooting in 28 years. America had 82 just in 2024. One country changed its laws after one tragedy. The other just keeps counting bodies. Rebecca is an Australian mother of 2. She visited Orlando in March 2025 with her family. At Disney World, she noticed armed security everywhere, guards with rifles, metal detectors, constant bag checks. This doesn't exist at Australian theme parks. Her 7-year-old daughter asked, "Mummy, why do the police have such big guns?" That night, the hotel TV showed breaking news, a school shooting in Georgia. The 34th that year. It was March. Rebecca couldn't sleep. Her daughter asked if they were safe. Rebecca had no answer. They flew home 3 days early. Here's what happened. After the 1996 Port Arthur massacre that killed 35 people, Australia enacted the National Firearms Agreement. Mandatory buyback of 650,000 guns. Strict licensing. Banned semi-automatic weapons. Since then, 0 mass shootings. We are talking 28 years with not a single incident involving 5 or more deaths. The U.S. has had 4,567 mass shootings since 1996. That's Gun Violence Archive data. In 2024 alone, 82 mass shootings, 656 deaths. Australia's firearm homicide rate, 0.18 per 100,000 people. America's, 4.12 per 100,000. That's 23 times higher, according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes 2025 data. Now, I know this one's controversial. Americans can't change federal law overnight, but you can support state-level red flag laws, safe storage requirements, and universal background checks. Organizations like Everytown and Moms Demand Action provide local advocacy tools. But here's something both political sides might actually agree on, and it happens every single election. 5. Mandatory voting. Australians get fined if they don't vote. Americans get obstacles if they DO. One country treats voting as a duty. The other treats it as a privilege you have to fight for. James is 42, an Australian engineer working in New York. He watched the 2024 US midterm elections in complete disbelief. His American colleagues spent hours debating which Tuesday to take off work, whether their polling places were still open, if their mail ballots would arrive in time. In Australia, voting happens on Saturdays. Polling places are everywhere: schools, community centers, church halls. There's always a democracy sausage fundraiser outside. And if you don't show up, you get a $20 fine. James voted in Australia's 2025 state election from New York at the consulate's pre-poll centre. It took 12 minutes total. Australia has had compulsory voting since 1924. Turnout: 92 to 95% consistently. US 2024 turnout: 62%. That's Pew Research data. Australia offers 6 to 7 weeks of early voting, mobile voting for remote areas, and penalties for not voting that range from $20 to $180 Australian dollars. Meanwhile, the US has reduced polling locations by 21% in predominantly minority neighborhoods since 2013. That's from a leadership conference on civil and human rights, 2025. Australia processes votes in hours. US battleground states take days or weeks. You can push for automatic voter registration, already in 23 states. Support vote-by-mail expansion. Make Election Day a federal holiday. Organizations like Fair Fight and the Brennan Center for Justice have the tools. Democracy works better when everyone participates. But even if you're not political, this next one affects your wallet every single day. 4. No tipping culture. That $18 burger in Australia, it costs $18. In America, add 20% tip plus tax, so now it's $24. Australians think American tipping culture is legalized wage theft, and they are not wrong. Sophie is an Australian food blogger. She toured US restaurants in 2025 for content. In Austin, Texas, she ordered a $22 meal. The bill came $24.42 with tax. Then the server hovered, clearly expecting more. Sophie, confused, asked her American friend, "Wait, don't they get paid by the restaurant?" Her friend explained, tip minimum wage is $2.13 per hour in some states. We subsidize their salary directly. Sophie was horrified. Back in Australia, her server friends earn $25 to $30 per hour base wage. Tips are rare, maybe for exceptional service. Same job. One country makes customers pay wages directly. Here's the data. Australian hospitality workers earn full minimum wage, 24.10 Australian dollars or higher. US tipped workers in 19 states earn as low as $2.13 per hour at the federal level. That's National Employment Law Project data from 2025. A 2024 Economic Policy Institute study found 15% of tipped workers live in poverty versus 6% of non-tipped workers. Tipping culture costs Americans an extra $240 billion annually. Australians pay higher menu prices upfront, but the total cost is often lower and always predictable. If you're American, support One Fair Wage campaigns. They're active in 7 states. Tip well to support workers now, but advocate for systemic wage reform so tipping becomes optional, not mandatory. That's everyday expenses. But what about when life goes wrong? The next one is why Australians don't fear unemployment the way Americans do. 3. Paid parental leave. Australian parents get 20 weeks of paid parental leave by law. American parents fight for scraps or quit their jobs. The US is the only developed nation without federal paid leave, but American politicians call Australia extreme. Emma is 31. She gave birth to twins in Melbourne in July 2025. She received 20 weeks of government-paid parental leave at $812 per week, plus 12 additional weeks from her employer. The husband took 2 weeks of partner pay. Total time home with the babies, 34 weeks. Paid. Her American sister, Michelle, gave birth in Ohio the same month. She got 6 weeks of unpaid FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. She burned through savings, returned to work exhausted at 5 weeks because she couldn't afford longer. Michelle cried every morning dropping her newborn at daycare. Australia's parental leave pay, 20 weeks at minimum wage for primary carers, plus 2 weeks for partners. That scheme was expanded in 2024. The US has 0 federal paid parental leave, only unpaid FMLA, and only for companies with 50 or more employees. 1 in 4 American mothers return to work within 2 weeks of childbirth. That's U.S. Department of Labor data from 2025. Australia's scheme costs $2.1 billion annually, but studies show it generates $1.4 billion in return via increased workforce participation and better child health outcomes. 13 U.S. states and D.C. have enacted paid family leave programs. Check your state benefits. Advocate for the Family Act. It's been pending since 2013. Negotiate employer-specific policies. New parents deserve support. But even if you never have kids, this next one affects your entire career. 2. Mandatory retirement savings. Every Australian employer must contribute 11.5% of your salary to your retirement account by law. In America, you beg for a 401k match, and 50% of workers have nothing saved. Australia solved retirement security in 1992. America's still debating it. David is 45, an Australian tradesman. He's never really thought about retirement. He didn't have to. Since his first job at 18, every single employer automatically contributed to his superannuation fund, now 11.5% of his salary. He never touched it, barely checked it. In 2025, he logged in out of curiosity. $340,000 Australian dollars saved. That's $220,000 US dollars. His American cousin, Greg, same age, same job type, had $12,000 in a 401k. His employers never offered matches. He couldn't afford to contribute on his own. David will retire comfortably at 65. Greg will work until he's 72, maybe longer. Australia's superannuation guarantee. Employers must contribute 11.5% of wages to employee retirement accounts. That's rising to 12% by July 2025. The U.S. has no mandatory employer retirement contribution. 50% of American workers have 0 retirement savings. That's Federal Reserve data from 2025. The average Australian retirement balance at age 60, $402,000 Australian dollars, average American, $182,000 US dollars. But the median is just $67,000. That's Vanguard data from 2025. If you're American, maximize any employer 401k match available. Open an IRA. Support legislative efforts for mandatory retirement systems like Australia's model. Retirement security matters. But there's one more thing Australians have that might be the most important of all. 1. Consumer protection laws. In Australia, if a company lies in an ad, breaks a product early, or refuses a refund unfairly, you can sue and win easily. In America, forced arbitration clauses trap you. One country protects consumers. The other protects corporations. Lisa bought a $1,200 laptop from a major retailer in Sydney in August 2025. It died after 14 months. She brought it back. The company said, warranties expired. 12 months only. Lisa invoked Australian consumer law. Products must last a reasonable time regardless of warranty. This is a $1,200 laptop. 14 months is not reasonable. The retailer refunded her fully within a week. No lawyer, no lawsuit, just the law. Her American friend, Mike, had the exact same experience in Denver with the same laptop brand. It died at 13 months. The company refused. Out of warranty, sorry. He found a forced arbitration clause buried in the purchase agreement. No class action lawsuits allowed. He ate the $1,200 loss. Australia's consumer law guarantees products must be of acceptable quality, fit for purpose, and last a reasonable time, rights that override any warranty a company tries to impose. Refunds are mandatory if goods fail these standards. The U.S. has no comparable federal consumer protection standard. 57% of American consumer contracts include forced arbitration clauses that ban class action lawsuits. That's Economic Policy Institute data from 2025. Australia's ACCC, the consumer watchdog, recovered $258 million for consumers in 2024. The US FTC recovered $94 million for a population 13 times larger. If you're American, check your credit card's consumer protections. Some cards offer extended warranties. Support the FAIR Act to ban forced arbitration. File complaints with state attorneys general. They sometimes override federal limitations. So those are 10 things Australians have that Americans are legally denied or simply don't have access to. Now here's the real question, and I actually want to hear from you on this. If you could bring just one of these Australian policies to America, which would it be and why? Healthcare, gun control, paid parental leave, mandatory retirement savings? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you're Australian watching this, tell the Americans what it's really like living with these so-called radical policies. Is it actually as good as the data suggests? Or is there a catch nobody's talking about? Let's see if we can learn something from each other. Because clearly, one of these countries figured some things out that the other one's still struggling with. I'll see you in the comments.